In this video, I'd like to talk about the thyroid gland, at least the biggest part of the thyroid gland, the thyroid follicles that produce hormones that affect metabolism. So first, let's take a look at the structure of the thyroid. I pulled up that real-time model, the 3D model that we have access to from the library. I thought I'd show you the thyroid here. So if we take away the muscles, you can see there's the thyroid gland. Increase size on that. So this is the larynx. Okay, that's where the vocal cords are housed. And so the thyroid, you can see it's a kind of a butterfly-shaped gland that's made up of a left lobe, a right lobe, and then that central piece is the isthmus. And the thyroid wraps right around the trachea. We'll be taking a look at the posterior surface of the thyroid in the next video, but you can see it's a very large gland, and I'm going to add arteries to our model and veins because I want to show you that it has a very rich blood supply. Okay, so the thyroid gland has a very, very rich blood supply, and when you take a look at it under the microscope, whether you look at, either side, the right side, left side, isthmus, front, back, top, bottom, it all looks the same under the microscope, which is this. So this is the AMP model I pulled up to show you. So here they're showing us what the thyroid looks like, and you look at this in lab, so hopefully you've seen this. It's basically made up of a basic subunit called a follicle. And a follicle is like a spherical structure. It's like a ball-like structure made out of a single layer of cube-shaped cells, and then there's fluid in the middle called colloid. So looking at this diagram, these are follicular cells. That's the single layer of cube-shaped cells. And then the fluid colloid, which is just a very protein-rich fluid, fills the follicles. So the thyroid gland has over a million follicles. It's just filled with follicles. And I like this picture from the model because not only are they showing us the follicles that are severed, like we'll see in lab, but they're showing you it's a spherical structure and it has a rich blood supply. So that's the majority of the thyroid, these follicles. But there are also these cells that are in between the follicles, and those are called parafollicular cells. And so the parafollicular cells, just back off so you can see the label on that, the parafollicular cells do something entirely different from the follicles. So at the time of development, when the thyroid forms, the follicles and the parafollicular cells come from two different locations, and subsequently they do two different things. It reminds me a little bit of the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. You know how they're related, they make one gland, but they're kind of, really separate entities. Same thing here. That's why in this video I'm going to focus just on the thyroid follicles. And then I'll come back and I'll talk about the parafollicular cells second. So taking a look at our notes, you can see I'm talking about how large the thyroid gland is, its location, its rich blood supply, the two lobes connected by the isthmus, at gross anatomy, that's what we can see with our bare eyes. And then the microscopic anatomy, like we were looking at, it's filled with these follicles. And then in between the follicles are the parafollicular, or also known as C cells. So in the notes, what I do is I start talking about the thyroid follicles. And just to show you my organization here, all of this information is about the thyroid follicles. And it's not until page 9 where I start talking about the parafollicular cells. So let's just focus on the follicles, and then we'll come back and look at the parafollicular cells. So the follicles, we looked at it already a little bit. It's made out of simple cuboidal epithelial tissue known as follicular cells. They surround this fluid called colloid, which is a protein-rich fluid, and that protein is coming from the follicular cells. So the follicular cells secrete produce and secrete this type of protein called thyroglobulin, and they secrete it into the colloid. And what it is it's an ingredient to make thyroid hormones. Okay, so the follicles produce thyroid hormones, and there are two thyroid hormones, triiodothyronine and thyroxine. T3 and T4. So in order to make T3 and T4, basically what you need is you need this amino acid, tyrosine, and tyrosine is very rich in this protein thyroglobulin. So when the cells make the thyroglobulin, you basically harvest the amino acid tyrosine from that protein. The other thing that we need to make thyroid hormones is iodine, and that comes from our dietary intake. And so you can see this, I'm just going to give you the summary here and then we'll look at a picture, that basically in the colloid, what will happen is enzymes link either 1 or 2 atoms of iodine onto the tyrosine amino acid. And what that does is it makes building blocks called monoiodotyrosine, MIT, okay, 1 iodine, or if it attaches 2 iodines, that's called diiodotyrosine. And those building blocks are in the colloid. That's where they're produced. And those building blocks are then used to assemble the hormones T3 and T4. So can you imagine if I take a mono and a di, bind them together, that is T3, triiodothyronine. If I take 2 dyes and bind them together, that is T4, thyroxine, also pronounced thyroxine. So in the notes, what I did is I sketched out a little picture here. There is a picture in your book that goes through this too, but I just thought maybe we could mark this one up together. So let's see what you think. So here I'm looking at the GI tract. So here's the stomach, here's the small intestine, and the reason that we care about that is because of the iodine. Okay, so we have to have iodine to make T3 and T4. If you don't have iodine to make T3 and T4, then you will have a deficiency in T3 and T4. You must have it. It's like wanting to make chocolate chip cookies and I don't have the chocolate chips, right? You must have the iodine to make T3 and T4. And so iodine is absorbed from the small intestine from our diet. And, you know, you might wonder, like, what dietary intake are we having that's rich in iodine? And I bet you know the answer to that. So salt, right? Iodized salt. Usually, you know, a typical diet is high in salt. That's what you usually hear about, high in salt rather than low in salt. And so salt is iodized, and that's where our iodine comes from. So what I'm doing in this picture is I'm just showing that it's coming in from our diet, and then it's going to be absorbed into the blood. And once the iodide, and iodide is just the ion of iodine, that's the way it's absorbed. It's a little detail. You really don't have to worry about that, but it's traveling in the blood as an ion. And then here, what I'm doing in the picture is I'm drawing a single follicle. So here's a thyroid follicle, a gigantic one, with, you know, its rich blood supply going by. So here are the follicular cells. Okay, so there's our single layer of cube-shaped cells. And here's the colloid, that protein-rich fluid inside of the follicle. So the way that this works is that when we absorb iodine from our dietary intake, at the level of the thyroid, we actually use active transport to bring that iodide in. Okay, it's called the iodide trap. And I just want to point out that we are using energy. We're continually spending energy to take that iodine into the follicular cell. And within the follicular cell, the iodide, the ion, gets converted back to iodine. I wrote that down here, but really, like I said, that's a bit of a detail. So once the iodine is in the colloid, so here, let's take a look at what's happening in the colloid. Well, we understand that these follicular cells are producing a protein called thyroglobulin. Okay, so sorry about that getting cut off there a little bit. So that's just a protein. We know that cells can easily make proteins, and we talked about that in AP1. So these cells make this thyroglobulin, and the reason that that's important, and this got cut off a little bit too, is because they're rich in, this protein is rich in the amino acid tyrosine. Okay, so tyrosine, that's just an amino acid. So what we can do is enzymes within the colloid can break apart the thyroglobulin and harvest this tyrosine. And then what will happen is either 1 or 2 iodine atoms will attach to the tyrosine, and this is going to give us our building blocks. And so what I did is I just used shapes. Okay, hopefully this makes sense. So here I have 1 iodine attaching, so that's monoiodotyrosine. Or if you get 2 iodines attaching to the tyrosine, that's called diiodotyrosine. And then these are building blocks within the colloid, and so those building blocks will then couple. So if the mono binds with a di, that would give us T3, the hormone T3. If a di binds with a di, that would give us the hormone T4. If a mono binds with a mono, that's just diiodotyrosine, and so that really, we're not concerned about that. So that's the way that T3 and T4 are produced. So you can see in this little diagram, what we're saying is that T3 and T4 are produced in the colloid, and they actually are in a continuous state of production. And so we're going to see that the thyroid breaks a few rules here, because usually, we would make a hormone just due to, a stimulus. But here we're continually making a hormone, and what happens is these follicular cells will form like a little invagination. This is endocytosis. It'll take a little gulp of that follicular fluid, and then that membranous vesicle just enters into the cell. T3 and T4 are freed from the membranous vesicle, and T3 and T4 are put into the blood from the follicular cell. So the follicular cell is the cell that's secreting the T3 and T4 directly into the blood, where they will bind to a carrier. Okay, so T3 and T4, even though they're very small, they do bind to a carrier within the blood. There are a few different major categories of carriers, and then they will go to the target tissue. So the target tissue, you can see I have body cell. Almost every single cell in the body has receptors for T3 and T4, because T3 and T4, what they do is they affect our basal metabolic rate, or in other words, they affect like the baseline of how we're utilizing nutrients and producing energy. So we'll continue to talk about this. I'm going to jump over to the notes and we can mark those up. Oh, I am in the notes, right? Okay. All right. So for regulation of secretion of thyroid hormones, it is upregulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, and the way that works is the hypothalamus monitors body temperature. If there's a decrease in body temperature, that is going to stimulate the hypothalamus to release thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is going to circulate to the anterior pituitary, cause the anterior pituitary to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, and then thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid follicles to secrete T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are produced in the colloid. We looked at that, endocytosed by the follicular cells and secreted into the blood. They bind to carriers to travel in the blood. So we looked at all of that in the picture. So here I'm going over that point that we're breaking some rules here, that T3 and T4 are in a continuous state of production and secretion. And so when thyroid stimulating hormone is released, what that does is it upregulates the production and it upregulates the secretion, but it's not like we don't have any until TSH is there. Okay, we will have production and secretion of thyroid hormones. And I'm going to jump over to the PowerPoint quick, because I want to show you, this is the picture from our book that goes through the same thing that I was trying to diagram in the notes. So we can see the iodide is going to enter, this is coming from our dietary intake, into the follicular cell, converted to iodine, released into the colloid, where it's going to combine with tyrosine to make mono and diiodotyrosines, which then combine to form the hormones T3 and T4, which will be endocytosed So it's not just the hormone. It's kind of like this cell will take like a gulp of that colloid, take a gulp of the fluid, bring in that membranous vesicle. T3 and T4 are released from the membranous vesicle, and then they float into the blood where they're going to bind to a carrier and travel to the target tissue. And almost every tissue is a target tissue. Once it gets to, or before I get to the target tissue, let's take a look at a few other pictures. So here, what they're showing us is if the hypothalamus senses a decrease in temperature, what's it going to do? We know that the hypothalamus regulates temperature. It could secrete TRH, circulate to the anterior pituitary, cause the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to stimulate the thyroid to release T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are going to enter into body cells, and they're going to up the metabolic rate. And one of the byproducts of metabolism is heat. And so the temperature should go up, and then that should turn this mechanism off. Here's another flow chart showing the same thing. The hypothalamus releases TRH, which targets the anterior pituitary. In response, it secretes TSH, targeting the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is going to release T3 and T4. Those are the thyroid hormones, which are going to target body cells to stimulate the utilization of nutrients to make energy. And in doing so, that's going to produce heat. And as that temperature goes up, it's going to negatively feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and so that upregulation backs off. And then this is just a little overview of metabolism, which we're not going to worry about these details yet. 2 videos from now we'll take a look at this, but I just wanted to point out, because it's not, difficult that, we eat these macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, and fats that we digest into the building blocks. And then as far as, what is metabolism? Metabolism is always a two-way street, right? We can either store it or use it. And so this is what T3 and T4 are doing. T3 and T4 are stimulating our cells to utilize nutrients, and the byproduct of that is heat. So T3 and T4 stimulates metabolism. Okay, so once T3 and T4 get to the target tissue, I'm going to go back to the notes here. It's another bit of a rule breaker, because even though it's an amine, which is a type of a protein hormone, due to their small size and their electrical neutrality, and also the fact that tyrosine, it's an amphipathic amino acid, meaning that it has characteristics of hydrophilic and hydrophobic. What happens is, even though it is a protein, it acts like a steroid. Okay, it diffuses through the plasma membrane. So we're used to that, where we've learned that that's what steroid hormones do. So this is another rule that's broken. What would happen is T3 and T4 are going to use the carrier to float around in the blood, but then they jump off the carrier and they slip right through the plasma membrane to bind to their receptors that are located in the cytoplasm and in the nucleus. I am going to cross out number 2 in my notes, the mitochondrial surface, because the primary mechanism is that they're going to bind to receptors in the nucleus, just like a steroid hormone, causing transcription and translation of enzymes involved in glycolysis. Glycolysis is the way we break down sugar prior to it entering into the mitochondria, so it's directly helping metabolism. Any T3 and T4 that bind in the cytoplasm will ultimately then go into the nucleus and have this effect. But you can see I'm saying that it's held in storage. That's another rule breaker. So not only are we producing the hormone in the thyroid follicles, kind of like in bulk, like a T3, T4 producing factory, we're secreting it at a low level, and then even at the target tissue, we can kind of hold it in storage a little bit. So there's a lot of rules being broken here that we talked about. So it's, it's kind of interesting. It's very interesting. So the net effect of thyroid hormones is that it increases the basal metabolic rate. And so we were saying that that's going to stimulate the mitochondria to make ATP. And of course, the mitochondria require oxygen. And so T3 and T4 will also increase oxygen consumption. And the byproduct is increasing heat production. So that's the short story of T3 and T4. That's what the thyroid follicles are doing. So there are some disorders on our list that we need to know. Let me show you these real quick. If we don't have enough T3 and T4, that can result in hypothyroidism. And you know what? Let me just back up one minute and just say that, even though we're talking about both T3 and T4, T3 and T4 will essentially have the same effect in the cell. So you're not really worried about at this level any difference between the two. Okay, there are differences between the two. If you get like more into this, like roll up your sleeves and look at like the affinity for receptors and stuff like that, but they both work in the same way. They have the same effects. So hypothyroidism, if we don't have enough T3 and T4, and T3 and T4 are stimulating the metabolic rate, you can imagine then you have a decreased metabolic rate. And if we're not utilizing nutrients, then we're storing nutrients. And so another characteristic is weight gain. Also, if you're not utilizing nutrients, you feel cold, right? Poor resistance to the cold. And then these are other clinical conditions that are associated with hypothyroidism. And I'm going to jump over to my PowerPoint just to show you some of those. So myxedema is an edematous swelling where it's like a bit of a thicker type of swelling. Like here you can see that the teeth left indentations in the tongue. So dry skin, coarse hair, these are characteristic of hypothyroidism. And then there are some other forms of hypothyroidism that we have on the sheet. Cretinism is a congenital absence of the thyroid gland. So in other words, either the thyroid gland never formed, or the thyroid gland formed, but it couldn't make any T3 and T4 because the person lacked iodine during gestation. And unfortunately, the mother's blood can't provide iodine, or not iodine, T3 and T4 to the offspring. So T3 and T4 must be produced by the offspring, can't be provided by the mother. And so if the offspring doesn't have iodine, can't make T3 and T4, and T3 and T4 are very crucial during development, as you can see in these pictures. It affects all of the big body-wide systems that we talked about in AP1. It affects the skeleton. So you can see they're showing us short stature. It affects muscle. Here they're showing the person holding a person up because they're unable to stand. Protruding belly has to do with poor musculature. The nervous system doesn't develop properly. Mental retardation is another characteristic. But you don't really see this because this is caught right away, and we can turn this around with T3 and T4 when it's caught right away. So another form of hypothyroidism is goiter, and goiter is a dietary deficiency of iodine. So it used to be really prevalent in this particular area of the country, in the Great Lakes region, because our naturally occurring foods are low in iodine. And so like we were saying earlier, if you don't have iodine, you can't make T3 and T4. And if you can't make T3 and T4, then your metabolism is low, right? You're not generating heat, which then is going to make your brain release thyroid stimulating hormone. And when the thyroid doesn't respond because it can't, because you don't have iodine, the brain releases more and more and more thyroid stimulating hormone. I hope that makes sense. And so what happens is the thyroid starts to enlarge, and that's known as goiter. So typically we would treat this with synthetic T4. So you could give Synthroid to the person, and hopefully this would regress. So that's what goiter is. And as far as hyperthyroidism, you can imagine excessive T3 and T4. You'd have an increased metabolic rate, so you're losing weight, you feel hot, and a characteristic that's associated with that is called exophthalmos, which is protruding of the eyes, which is somewhat common. Here you can see that they're showing us a scar that the person's thyroid was removed, and the characteristics of hyperthyroidism. Here you can see goiter, a photo of goiter, a photo of exophthalmos. There is a type of hyperthyroidism called Graves' disease. This is the Netter's illustration showing the characteristics of Graves' disease. Basically, it's an autoimmune disorder. And so with Graves' disease, it is hyperthyroidism, but it's due to the person producing antibodies against their own thyroid. And so if a person produces antibodies against their own thyroid gland, you would think that maybe it would kill the thyroid gland, you know what I mean? Like hurt the thyroid gland. But what it does is it stimulates the thyroid gland, just like TSH. And so what you see in Graves' disease is, this hyperthyroidism. So they're showing, sweating, the exophthalmos, tremor, from the hyperthyroidism. So in order to have Graves' disease, you have to test positive for the antibodies against the thyroid. So I'm going to come back in another video and talk about the parafollicular cells. So this video is all about those follicles making T3 and T4. See you next time.